Now, the Ethiopian-American journalist Hermela Aregawi, who needs no introduction to our audience, was instrumental in the hashtag No More movement that she spearheaded. She's also playing her part in the struggle against the recent bills and sanctions looming large against Ethiopia. And she's my guest today, ladies and gentlemen, in this edition of Addis Dialogue with the program. I'm Shifarao. You stay with us. Hermela, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me, and it's really good to see you.
Thank you, Shifra, for having me.
Let's start off with this question. As you know, these sanctions, bills, threats of sanctions, these are the parlances or catchphrases that we are so accustomed to these days, right? And now this HR 6600 and S3199. What is going on and why Ethiopia? Let's start our discussion.
Yeah, all these types of bills, these sanctions bills, first of all, always sound really good, right? The title is Ethiopia Stabilization, Peace and Democracy Act. But when you think about the role that a lot of people in Congress have played, particularly the ones who have sponsored this bill and co-sponsored the bill, they've spent a lot of the time, including right now, really pushing the TPLF narrative. Yeah. So the first thing is you got to look at who the source is, right? Why should we expect people that have been pro-TPLF and the narrative that they have been pushing? This bill was started by TPLF supporters, although there are a small section of a group that claims to be the protectors of Amharas, or that claims to be pushing this bill to protect Amharas, that does support it. But it's really so extreme when you look at the wording. It basically, what it does is it puts the US Congress as the government of Ethiopia, right? Essentially what it's saying is we want to run the government. We want to get reports every 6 months about what's going on in the country, in the goal of ending this war. So on the premise, it's saying this government doesn't know what it's doing. This African government can't govern, so we want to do it. So it's essentially neo-colonization. Really, when you look at it, it's so extreme in the things that it asks for. It asks for a report from the government every 6 months for at least 5 years. Why? It's such an extreme thing to expect. So it's really peculiar that there are even some people that actually support it and that believe that this will actually hold the Ethiopian government accountable in terms of some of the issues that are happening in the Walaga region. What it really does is it's going to control the government, and it's going to punish the government, its people, and then those of us who are outside of the country who they believe are taking part in disinformation and hate speech. And we know the narrative between what the US Congress believes, or some of the people in US Congress believes this conflict is about, and the narrative that most Ethiopians, most Eritreans, and most people in that region believe are at conflict. So that puts all of us who have been fighting against this false narrative also in danger of sanctions, in danger of certain visas being restricted. So it's very wide. It casts a very wide net in terms of who it tries to control.
Wide indeed. And this is, coming in, notwithstanding what the government of Ethiopia has done to meet US demands, as you know, over the past years. And these sanctions are still being pushed in the face of all these efforts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that the Ethiopian economy, like every economy during a war, is struggling. It's unnecessarily having to put money into the war when it could be putting it into the rest of the country. So when you're talking about more economic sanctions, we saw Ethiopia removed from AGOA. We're talking about more sanctions, even more extreme kind of economic limitations, like limiting certain international loan access that the Ethiopian government may have if it doesn't meet the expectations of Congress. And who is that going to hurt ultimately? It's not going to be some of the people in government. It's going to go down to the people. And there is there's no record of US sanctions actually making another country's government better, more democratic, more stable, more peaceful. What it actually does is it pins that government, like it did in Cuba and Iran, into a corner, into an even tighter economic corner. And that usually doesn't bring out the best in people or in governments. So it's essentially putting more pressure on the government than it already has, it being that it's in the middle of an active war. And that's not going to turn out better for the people. We know there are some security issues that are not being addressed by the Ethiopian government. I don't believe it's intentional. You know, I don't have evidence one way or the other, but the point is we have a resource limitation, and that's because this active war. So if we can just stop the war, which is just kind of get to the source of it, which is TPLF, and have Congress actually call for TPLF to disarm, then we can push the government to do more. But as long as we're not handling the source of the conflict and putting it back on the government, it's only going to make things worse.
And Ethiopians have been voicing their frustration, anger, and dismay over these latest measures, which are not only existential threats, but also the infringement of national sovereignty or territorial integrity. Do you see any point there?
Absolutely. Like I said, this is really basically saying, forget the Ethiopian government, let us Congress be the US government. Let me point out a couple of things in the bill. I know HR 6600 more than I know 3199. 3199 doesn't have as much support anyhow, but HR 6600, the concerning thing about that, although I don't think it's extremely concerning, is that there are some groups who aren't the pro-TPLF activists that actually support that because they think somehow it's going to hold the Ethiopian government accountable. So that's what we're focusing on. We're trying to have conversations with people and saying, we know you have real concerns. Some of you, some of the leaders don't actually care about the real concerns, but is there another way for us to push for more reform and security? So there's a couple of things, and I'm getting a lot of this information, not just from myself, but from a lawyer that we spoke to here in the United States, Dereja Demise. He held a 2-hour Zoom call with us the other day. So he was able to really go through with it. And he basically says what the bill tries to do is to controls and monitor the legal process in Ethiopia. It wants for the government or for people in government that it selects to give it certain reports about what's being done in terms of ceasefire negotiations, a court process, humanitarian delivery. And then it wants to decide based on that how it wants to sanction the government. And like I said, those of us overseas who are considered helping somehow or getting in the way of progress.
As you know, Ethiopia has finally resorted to humanitarian truce in its efforts to ensure lasting peace and create a fertile ground for national dialogue. So personally, what is your take on this latest move by the Ethiopian government?
Listen, I would love for this to be the beginning of the end, right? We saw in June the humanitarian ceasefire that was called a sick joke by TPLF. That was the moment for me, although I had a lot of doubts before then. That was the moment I thought, like, after all this, after saying say no to war, there was an opportunity to actually bring peace. That was what, less than a year from the war starting, and we really missed that opportunity. And by we, I mean mostly TPLF is what it seems, right? So this time around, what I'm hoping for, although I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to hold my breath on it, but what I'm hoping for is that this truce and this ceasefire actually stays, that the people calling the shots in Tigray really just come to terms with the reality of this, that it's only going to get worse, that there is no winning at this point. Maybe there can be some concessions made. I know we did not like the release of some of the prisoners in January, but to me, those kind of concessions, although not very popular, they're not very damaging in terms of they don't really put any new people in danger. And if it kind of makes certain sides feel like they're being heard, so be it. If it gets some of the most violent leadership in Tigray out of the country or out of the way so that we can make peace, I personally, I'm pro you know, some flexibility in terms of negotiations, but I think the line should be drawn at arms down. TPLF cannot have arms up. That, I think, is sort of the red line for a lot of people. But anything within that or anything outside of that, I personally am open to, because this war has gone too long, and we know there's a lot of people in Tigray, in the Amhara regions, in the Afar region that have been suffering. By the way, this bill, particularly HR 6600, does not mention Amhara or Afar at all. And it also mentions TPLF twice, which some people say, see, it's also going to try to hold TPLF accountable. And again, like I said, the people who wrote this bill are actually pro-TPLF themselves, so that is unlikely. But beyond that, one of the times that TPLF is mentioned, it's mentioned in the context of the genocide determination. If that was to happen by the State Department, that would open the doors for military intervention. And we have seen what happens to countries when the US militarily intervenes. So what I tell people these days and recently is, I know it's bad. I know it's bad out there and we all want it to end, but don't forget, this can actually get a lot worse. Don't forget, we averted some of the worst that could happen in Ethiopia by the grace of God, by the hard work of the people on the ground there. And I like to think some of us, of some of the work we were doing in the diaspora also helped a little bit, but mostly by the work that's being done on the ground there. So it's just, you know, if we let something like this go, and we're not going to, it would really open the doors for the US to be able to do whatever it wanted in the country.
On a brighter note, the United States of America seems to be interested in what is unfolding in Ethiopia, as you know, following the government's decision to put in place the humanitarian truce. So is it kind of sincere? You know, what is this shift of stance all of a sudden in your view? And are they trying to buy some time for the TPLF, or what is it there?
And you know,
we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. And John, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't really believe the good faith in some of the people that are running foreign policy in the US when it comes to Ethiopia. I thought that maybe in January, you know, when I was there, and President Biden had a conversation with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed for the first time. It felt like a shift. It felt like a change in tone. And then what did we see? We saw a little bit of it for a while, and then we saw a complete reversal back to what we were seeing from some of the politicians, from some of those that were pushing these two bills, as well as from the Western media. It kind of gave us a little break. It was trying to look like it was two-sided, putting out some of the reports from Amnesty of what some of the TPLF militias were doing in the Amhara region, and then it flipped back. And we saw the New York Times putting out this ridiculous article, very thin evidence, blaming an Ethiopian general that ordered the shooting of three aid officials, and its sources being military or soldiers that were imprisoned under TPLF. I mean, that is not a reliable source. It's basically saying this story came from some people who had a gun to their heads, but you know what? We made sure that they didn't really have a gun to their heads, that they were really saying what they wanted to say. That's essentially what the article says. And it's really honestly ridiculous coming from my perspective and coming from the field of work that I do. If this was written about the United States by another outside media, we would all be outraged. So we are outraged, as we should be.
You know, Ethiopia is also gearing towards its national dialogue to help ensure lasting solutions to some of the lingering issues in the country. So how realistic and successful can the dialogue be, in your view, in achieving the intended goals?
You know, this is the point that I'm actually hopeful in. I think as long as there is not Western interference or outside interference in these conversations, as long as there's not pressure from the US to push one group or another to do something, I do believe in the people in that country, including some of the folks from Tigray that are operating in good faith. So I have hope that if we have an opportunity to have the arms down on both sides, to really get some reasonable people at the table, trying to deal with all the perspectives, to hold people accountable on all sides that have committed atrocities in this war. I do think this could change. I mean, people, we've gone through this as a country well before my time, and people that were enemies 10 years ago become best friends 10 years later. So when it comes to negotiations and the conversation within the country, as long as we pick the right people who really want the best for everybody and not just for their ethnic group or their political group, I do have faith that there will be some reconciliation among us.
Yeah, let's hope so, Hermela. I know, and of course, everybody knows, everybody else knows the great contribution that you've been making in the hashtag No More movement, and you're also contributing towards preventing this bill from being approved. So, what are some of your plans? Let's also talk about a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, we're back. I know a lot of people were saying No More was quiet. Thanks. Quiet for a long time. I mean, the truth of the matter is life gets in the way. We're all people at the end of the day. Many of the folks that work on this movement have other full-time jobs. It's a little bit emotionally taxing, for those of us who are new to the advocacy world. So you have to kind of learn to manage, to take breaks, to take care of yourself. And so that's sort of what we all did. We needed to regroup and really think about the next steps. We're having a lot of conversations with people from, of course, Eritrea, Somalia, Mali, Answer Coalition, which is an anti-imperialist, an anti-war group here in the US, who have been incredible allies with us. And so we've had a lot of conversations amongst us about what to do next. We are more active on social media, and there is some stuff that is loading very soon. I don't want to say too much, but there's a lot of conversations that are happening behind the scenes. And there's a lot of work even right now being done on HR 6600. San Francisco Bay Area was out in the streets today, Friday, March 25th. It's night here, so Friday, March 25th. And then on Monday, DC always has a great showing. They're going to be rallying against both of these bills, but particularly HR 6600, because that seems to be the one that has a little bit more support. And then there's a few other cities that will be going out to rally a little bit after that. And, hopefully we're going to do another big one once we create more content, once we have more conversations amongst us, kind of bridge some of these divides and really try to address some people's legitimate issues. And then also just to eliminate who's going to be a part of the problem moving forward, because what you're finding, or what we're finding, is that as we move forward, there's some people that aren't really for Ethiopia, that aren't really for that region. They're in it for their own divisive agenda. And so I think eliminating some of that leadership will be important. And part of that is really trying to talk to the people that are under them, that mean well, that think that they're doing things that for the right reasons, and really just clarifying, because anyone that's pushing for HR 6600 to go through is absolutely anti-Ethiopia. I mean, it's so clear cut. There's really no gray area about it.
Yeah, indeed. So what's your message to the Ethiopian government, to Ethiopian expats, the diaspora, and of course, some Americans that are against this bill? And what is the best way to make sure the bills won't pass?
A lot of good questions. So, okay, so this is a good opportunity. I mean, this isn't the first time I'm saying this to some government officials, but I think it's really important to communicate what the government is doing while it's doing it. I know it does a lot of good work in terms of rebuilding and building and trying to get peace, but if nobody knows about it, it's kind of like, it leaves room for people to speculate. The other thing is that we keep hearing over and over from Ethiopians here in the diaspora is, why doesn't the government say something about some of the atrocities that are happening in the Welaga region, where we see just a mass number of civilians, it looks like civilians, that are being killed what they want to hear. A lot of people understand that the security issue is very difficult, but what they keep telling us as we have these meetings is we need the government to say something and say, hey, we know this is happening. We're sorry about the loss of life. We are looking into it. I don't think that's a lot to ask for. So I think that's what I would say with to the government. Also, some of the stories, and I know this is kind of more of a media thing, but also really a government thing. Some of the IDPs that are coming from Tigray to the Amhara regions, we need to broadcast that. I mean, I also am a part of that as well, right? So I'm going to try to do my best, but I really think it should come from the government to say, listen, we're sending all this aid in. Here's how much is going by air. Here's what we're able to get through the ground. I have young people from Tigray that honestly just want to know what's going on. They want to know that aid is going in, and they come to me on the side and say, hey, like, what do you know about the aid going in? And I try to tell them whatever information I get, because they genuinely do start to believe what the Western media says about this de facto blockade, that the siege is happening. So I can't emphasize enough, and I've had this conversation over and over again, I'm sure I'll have it many more times. The government needs to communicate what it's doing, and it needs to communicate it to everybody else and not just to the people within Ethiopia. As far as the people in the diaspora, a lot of them I talk to every day. I think we need to try to stay unified as much as possible. I understand we all have our own minds, and there should be space for people to disagree, to debate, to dislike somebody if they want to, but ultimately just don't forget that the larger issue is the country needs to move forward. It needs to have peace. It needs to develop. The people deserve it. There's so many people that are living under really unacceptable conditions, and we have the capacity, we have the resources to really live up to our potential. So I think that's something that just to keep in mind. And these bills just aren't it. It's not going to be the US that saves Ethiopia. It's not going to be Ethiopia that saves the US. Each government should be allowed to figure out how to handle its country and its people, and Ethiopia is no different.
Okay. Let me also ask you, Hermela, this question. It's hope that this bill won't pass. But if the worst comes, if push comes to shove and this bill passes, what would happen and what should be done?
We'll be on the streets the day of. I mean, I can't imagine that the US House, Congress, with all that's going on in Ukraine, with all that's going on with Russia, I cannot imagine that they would pick this fight with the horn and forego the diplomatic process. But I also just can't say, it absolutely won't happen. I mean, we've been surprised before, but I guarantee you there will be a very strong and immediate response. But we don't want it to go there. We don't want it to be reactionary after it happens, because that's going to be a difficult thing to navigate. So we're trying to, as much as possible, deal with it. By the way, we're also supporting some candidates that are going against those who sponsored or co-sponsored the bill. So that's also one way we're trying to send a message to those who think that this bill is acceptable.
Okay. Hermela, thank you so much for your time, for your work, and keep up the great job. And I hope we will meet again sometime.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program, and many thanks for having tuned in so far. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me.